It's the left versus the right. In the right corner, it's James Flippin. In the left corner, it's Anthony Weiner. Live from Studio 77, it's a 77 WABC debate.
Welcome to Left versus Right. Anthony Weiner on your left, James Flippin on your right. Our first episode of 2025. I hope all of our listeners had a wonderful holiday. You as well, James. But, you know, here it was, New Year's Day. We're waking up, and some of us hadn't even gone to sleep yet, and two horrific things seem to happen all at once. We've had a little opportunity to sit back, but I've been eager to get your input on this because you sit on that strata between opinion and information. You're a news guy. You do the news breaks with Liz and with Noam and everyone else. And then you also do opinion shows like this one. This was one of those moments that the opinion guys were way out ahead of the news guys. Did we learn anything about, well, let me ask you, when you see something like that happen, you're trying to figure out what to report to our listeners, and so much speculation is going on, it must be very hard in today's day and age just to sit and wait to see what the facts are, because what we learned at the beginning was very different from what we found out later on.
Well, okay, and I definitely, first of all, thanks for wishing me a Happy New Year, Anthony. I feel the same way to all our listeners and you, and I think that it was kind of a devastating start to the new year to have something like that happening in the early morning hours, and you think of revelers on Bourbon Street. It's like such an American image, yep. Celebrating New Year's. And as far as reporting on it, it does get tricky, and we saw this with the subway burning case, where there was a false identity put out of a victim that kind of fit
right. We're going to talk about that later as well, yeah.
And in this case, you didn't hear as much early on out of New Orleans about the identity of the attacker or the potential motivations from official accounts. Right. You heard,
but Fox News got way out over their own skis and put out the story that the truck came in from Mexico,
right?
And that turned out to be wrong.
Well, and I think that there's an interesting perspective that you're alluding to in being somebody who's kind of right of center, a little bit distrustful, let's say, of the federal government, always trying to be pro law enforcement when possible because of the desire for law and order and stuff like that. But there's also this perception that sometimes you're wondering on the conspiratorial side, what's really going on here? And I will say, when I first heard about that story, supposedly a truck driving from Mexico, crossing at Eagle Pass,
right,
coming into Texas. It's a
little too on the nose.
It's an electric vehicle also.
Yeah.
And the guy's got ISIS flag and all this. I'm like, wait a second. What's really going on here? You kind of get a little bit suspicious.
Right.
But, yeah, that story in terms of the truck coming from Mexico, obviously I guess that was the guy who owned the truck. That was
it turned out to be wrong, that something didn't come in 2 days ago, that it had crossed months ago. They had to dial it back. But the point is that as a news guy, you hear stuff, and you hopefully, on a station like ours where we kind of pride ourselves of, at least in the news department, being straight down the middle. You can hear stuff all the way, and Fox News goes out and reports this. It's wrong, and then to make matters worse, the president, Donald Trump, the incoming president, tweets it out to make a point. I mean, it is so hard to do. It must be very hard in your line of work just to sit still until you know exactly what happened, because there must be such an appetite to leap to conclusions about things, and that got a lot of people in trouble as the early days of this story unfolded, because what we found out later on and what we heard originally turned out to be very far apart.
Well, look, I think that there's multiple things happening at once. And like you said, it is kind of difficult to not get out in front of it sometimes. And you do your best to just say, okay, there are these reports out there about this. No one really knows for sure if that's actually true. I think you kind of have to do that in this day and age, and you probably always did when it comes to what police say or what officials say, what the government says. It's like, okay, the government official says this, that this is what the account officially is at this point.
Well, you say government officials as if there's something else. Like, what, just some random dude on the internet is going to start to tell you what to say?
I mean, look,
if you're not going to, you can't do the reporting yourself. I mean, unless you have a big newsroom of people who are going to go start interviewing people who are at the scene.
Yeah.
Or you're going to start tracking down registrations. You got to rely on government officials. Here's the problem I think that we're seeing here. People like you, I hate to say it, have bred so much trust in the people that tell us what the facts are about stuff that now when they say, hold off, don't report that because it might not be true, people don't do it. They go out and report it anyway, and that winds up getting people into a lot of trouble.
Well, but, okay, you say people like me. I feel that it's the misdeeds of the entities in question that have caused a lot of that distrust. So in other words, you think of the FBI, you think of the investigation of school board meetings because parents were upset about transgenderism and indoctrination in schools, and the Department of Justice says, well, we need to investigate that. These parents are extremists. And then they talk about white supremacy, and there's all these prosecutions of people who stand near abortion clinics and protest. And it's like, wait a second, are our priorities really proper here within the federal investigation force? Did they miss something here because they're not as worried about Islamic terrorism? And the guy did have an ISIS flag last we heard. So, you know, again,
right, but that's a very different thing. Saying you don't like that they investigated something is very different than saying don't believe them when they say what happened at a terrorist
it's a general
attack.
skepticism. It's a general skepticism of what's going on, because when you hear the governor of Louisiana, a Republican, by the way, getting in his comments, everybody wants to look on their phone and try to get to the bottom of this. It's like, well, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
Well,
this is the information age.
Right. And
we don't necessarily have to wait back and just hear from you guys as to what the official account is. There's other information that comes to light.
That's wrong.
And sometimes that's ahead of the official account.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Is that the question becomes, who can you rely upon not to make zero mistakes, but who you can rely upon to give us the closest thing to the facts as we can get them. And if you're saying, well, I'm going to rely on someone that I see online, come up with a theory about a thing, those guys are not news. That's not news. Ultimately, the FBI, the FBI is in charge of investigating.
ABC, CBS, NBC?
Well, obviously not Fox News.
Okay.
Right? Because they got it wrong. Those other ones at least got this right. Didn't report a rumor.
That kind of stuff does happen. Like CNN had some sort of Syrian supposed refugee they were bringing to freedom, and it turned out to be a terrorist.
I 100% agree with you that news organizations make mistakes. But this is the alternative. I'm not saying believe everything Fox News says. Frankly, they are usually wrong. I'm saying that if you don't believe the people that are paid by the taxpayers to investigate crimes, and you don't wait to hear what they have to say, not that they don't make mistakes and sometimes the wrong people get arrested and people go free, but there has to be something resembling. And when you're the president of the United States, getting to what Donald Trump's role in this, you have people who follow your every lockstep. Call them cult members if you want. I'm not going to, because it's a new year and I've made a resolution about that.
I was going to say, you must have turned over a new leaf.
Totally. But to take something that you get, spray it out there to make a political point, and then when you find out you're wrong, not having the respect for your followers to say, oops, we had this wrong. It turns out this is not someone who came in from Mexico over illegal. That turned out wrong. When Fox News pulled it back, did Donald Trump pull back his tweet? No. Did Eric Trump pull back his tweet? No. Mm-hmm. So it's out there in the ether. I think if you're going to run the federal government, you should have the common sense to say, I'm going to wait for the people that run the federal government who do investigations.
But again, that's fair and well to say, and maybe you would appreciate that sort of measured restraint from the chief executive or whatever. But these modern politicians, none of them show that kind of restraint, whether it's the Jussie Smollett thing that came out and everybody wanted to say, it's a modern-day lynching, this is the white supremacy gone wrong. And if you want to talk about some of the responses to the lawfare cases where President-elect Trump was prosecuted. I'm not talking about politicians.
I'm talking about, do you believe the FBI?
Trump is a politician.
I understand, but he's spreading disinformation and then, say, oops, I got it wrong. He never does that. And by the way,
he doesn't tend to do that ever.
Right. He should do that. He should. First of all, you're now the president-elect of the United States. Just reading something on Twitter that was posted by someone should not lead you to go start. Have a little respect for the people that work in law enforcement to say, they're saying, let's wait.
Yeah.
They're saying we don't know.
I can't imagine why Trump wouldn't have respect for the federal cops that basically tried to persecute him for any number of years. I'm not sure I understand your point. So therefore now for the next 4 years, the people that work for the FBI we shouldn't believe? Well, that's why the most important incoming member of the Trump cabinet is Kash Patel.
Right,
because
he doesn't believe the FBI either.
Right, because there's no capital of trust between the FBI and the American people, Anthony. I know that's difficult to accept because everybody, once upon a time, we thought of the FBI as like, the gold standard. Basically, they were going to take care of it in terms of investigating the mob or cracking down on drugs or looking at terrorists or whatever it may be. But right now, the perception for many Americans is that they've taken their eye off the ball, that they're worried about DEI programs and all this kind of stuff and not cracking down on ISIS.
You know what
supporters.
I find an interesting snake eating its tail kind of element to this. Trump and his supporters have been yelling, mostly Trump, oh, don't trust the FBI when they're investigating me. Don't trust the FBI when they're investigating me. And then you say, look how many people don't trust the FBI. Yes, they don't trust the FBI because for years, Donald Trump has been lying about the FBI and saying they're prosecuting him only because he's Donald Trump. Okay, putting aside the fact that the FBI investigated Anthony Weiner, and I'm the furthest thing from Donald Trump you'll ever get. Look, there is a reason this distrust exists. It's because people like you keep saying, I don't trust the FBI. And I'm saying stop saying that, because what it does is it takes people like Fox News, go out and say wrong things, and the FBI says, whoa, and you're like, well, I believe Fox News before I believe the FBI, and we're in the problem that we're in.
The snake eating the tail is a good analogy. I think you could say chicken and the egg as well, right? Like what preceded it? Was it just people sowing distrust?
The egg came first because where'd the chicken come from?
Right. All right,
For our next segment.
I think I agree with you on that one. All right, good. Yeah. No, I think that there is a lot to be found still. It's still much to be discovered about New Orleans. Maybe the Las Vegas thing is coming a little bit more into focus in terms of the guy's ex-wife and him.
Well, let's talk about that. That's a good point. Let's talk a little bit about because you and I have had the benefit now. You had to be on the air a lot. I haven't been. So we got a chance to let this flesh out. And we basically learned that two members of the military, two guys seem like they were going through things. Do you consider them terrorists, these two guys?
Well,
based on what you know now?
Yeah. I mean, I think definitely, let's say based off the current fact pattern, New Orleans, no question, right? Like the guy clearly wanted to sow fear and panic and chaos amidst an event like a New Year's Eve celebration on Bourbon Street and killed people in the process and professed his support for ISIS and had all these bombs that he wanted to explode and all that. So that kind of fits the definition, unless there's other stuff that I'm not aware of, like it's some sort of a deep state operative and the guy had a chip in his brain and somebody said, hey, there you go do it.
I mean, I guess the distinction I make is, look, he's a guy that went around the bend for whatever reason. We'll probably learn more of that. We're talking
about Shamsud and Jabbar.
Be honest, sounds like both guys. Both guys had some form of an emotion, it seems. Mm-hmm. The thing about the terrorism thing is, I think now we've kind of gotten into this place. Yeah, a lot of people commit acts of crime to terrorize people. If someone goes into a theater and is blowing people up because or going to a Las Vegas concert, they're trying to create terror. Mm-hmm. I mean, this guy happened to have said, I'm an ISIS. So there is that. I mean, there's a lot of...
Well, why do you ask the question? Like, what do you mean?
I guess what I'm trying to get at is, they're two individual guys who had individual things go on in their life that led them to do horrible things.
Well, what's the sort of potential motivation for the New Orleans guy?
Well, he had a bad thing in his marriage. Who knows? He was a Trump supporter and wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. I don't know. The point I'm making...
You're talking about Las Vegas.
I'm talking about Las Vegas, New Orleans. They both have... One of the ways to do this is to narrow it down to just two guys who went around the bend. All right, if it turns out... And the guy... ISIS became the thing to be upset about.
Okay,
the other guy, it might have been something else.
So you're suggesting like the guy's life was going down a bad path and he was searching for motivation and he said, ISIS.
Here's my overall thing. My overall thing is we like to have narratives that explain things. That's why when these first two cases came out and said, two guys who rented trucks at the same place. Something's going on here. And it just turned out, maybe we'll learn something more that these guys happened to. We know that there's always a high threat of terrorist attacks on January 1st. And here they are, a couple of things that happened on January 1st. But I guess what I'm saying is...
there's fear of sleeper cells and kind of like a larger plot and stuff like that. With good reason, though, right? I
guess yes and I guess no. We have 300 million people in this country, whatever it is. Yes, people sometimes just do crazy things and they do horrible acts that are terrible, but we try to build a story around them. ISIS. When the original story came out about the car, the Tesla in flames outside of the Trump Hotel, I even tweeted something funny about it. I said that's kind of on the nose that you'd have a
similar to what we talked about with the New Orleans thing, where it was like so much red meat. I said it on the air. I was like, wow, this is a lot of like kind of
right.
checking
I
the
just
boxes
thought it
for
was
our
like
audience.
okay, a funny coincidence, one overheated, because sometimes these batteries do go up in flames.
Right.
And I immediately took it down, and I realized that no, this is something terrible
else,
going
yeah.
on. But the point is, we keep wanting to have these narratives.
Well, but wait a second, though. The one thing I'll say is it is part of the narrative that this guy professed support for ISIS, that he is a Muslim, that he went out there wanting to kill people.
Right.
What do you mean by became one?
I mean, the guy, there's a lot of talk. I mean, there's
Everybody
a lot of,
eventually becomes
no, but we
something
have
of
a
their own
lot of
faith.
information that people get self-radicalized around all kinds of different crazy conspiracy theories. We had a guy walk into a pizzeria in Washington and shoot someone because they believe the Q conspiracy. I'm just saying that to call this terrorism seems to speak to people as if it is more than just an individual guy doing a crazy thing.
But hold on. But at the same time, the guy's trailer in Texas had the Quran open to a certain passage where it says more or less, I don't even remember what it was, something along the lines of you infidels will burn, intifada, all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's part of the story.
I understand, but why, by calling it terrorism any more than a guy who goes into a movie theater because he, whatever
But
he
I'm,
believes.
I'm not picking up what you're putting down. Are you trying to say you have a problem with the term
I'm
terrorism?
saying yes. I'm saying that it gets painted as a way to try to understand things. Like, for example, for 4 years, Donald Trump was telling us he wiped out ISIS, right? Okay, so there's no ISIS anymore.
Well,
okay,
is it ISIL? Is it ISIS? Is it the Islamic Caliphate? Is it
Donald
the
Trump
Muslim
said he wiped
Brotherhood?
it out within weeks. That's his whole thing.
Okay.
And there's no
there was an
evidence.
effective military operation
And there's
that took
no
out.
evidence that anyone outside this guy's orbit was involved. Now, maybe that changes. Was involved in any way. This
Like
guy,
some representative of ISIS.
he's self-radicalized, and we've seen that over and over again. We now know the language of lone wolf is now a new thing.
Well, yeah, but here's the thing I'm not quite getting in terms of what you're talking about. Like, if somebody kills somebody because they wanted to take their money, then that's the motive behind why they killed them. If somebody sets fire to a place because they want to file an insurance claim, that's their motivation for doing it. If somebody drives a truck down Bourbon Street because they believe that they're answering Islam's call, then that's their motivation.
I understand. If you want to, okay, so he's motivated radical, whatever. The idea of calling it terrorism implies an outside threat to our country.
Okay.
Don't you think? I mean, we've just kind of watered down the phrase so far that now it's an individual guy who was Christian till a couple of years ago. Now he's Muslim. He leaves his book open to the, I mean, yes, you can find crazy motivations in every mass murder that we have in this country.
Okay.
Except this one, we're like, it's terrorism. Why? Simply because people were terrorized?
Well, because I think the key is, like, you don't have, in the modern sense, right, whether it's in Africa, the Middle East, here in the U.S., Europe, you don't have Jewish and Christian terrorists like you do Islamic terrorists.
Overwhelmingly, the mass murders in our country have been by people who are not Muslim.
Yes, but they're not motivated by that religious
They
theology.
totally are. They're totally quoting Bible verses and quoting conspiracy theories and quoting documents all the time. That happens. The guy up in Buffalo quoted the Bible when he went and did his thing. That's the point I'm making. We want to make things pat. We want to make things clearly understandable in a way so we feel, all right, this won't happen to me or won't happen again.
I think that's true.
And so we're terrorists. To me, terrorism used to imply, in the days of September 11th, an outside force trying to do something to our country. This was an individual guy that lost his marbles and slaughtered a bunch of people in New Orleans.
I mean, again, I feel like if you don't like the term terrorism because you think it implies foreign involvement, I understand that. I can actually potentially get behind it. Let's just call him a crazed Islamic murderer who was inspired by elements of the Quran, unfortunately. Sadly, I mean, that's what it looks like is true.
Or either that, or let's throw around domestic terrorist when it's someone who does it here in the United States.
A domestic Islamic terrorist.
No, right, but if you want to keep putting the Islamic, then you've got to put Christian in front of all the Christian mass murderers.
Oh, Anthony,
are you going to do that?
That's a phrase that I used earlier today, which I enjoy, and I think it applies here, as being willfully obtuse. Because you know that there's elements of the Quran that are inspiring a guy like this and others who do this kind of thing. The guy who drove the truck down the West Side Highway here in New York on Halloween. In other words, they're not just saying, oh, okay, I'm really, really angry at these people and I'm going to go do this. They're doing it based off their internal motivations as connected to Islam. If the guy up at the top supermarket in Buffalo specifically identified as a Christian terrorist, I missed that one.
Well, people do quote the Bible when they do bad things, but willfully obtuse, maybe we'll change the show name to Willfully Obtuse. And we'll be right back after the break.
It's the left versus the right. In the right corner, it's James Flippin. In the left corner, it's Anthony Weiner. 77 WABC.
So welcome back to Left versus Right. Anthony Weiner and James Flippin. Anthony Weiner on the left, James Flippin on the right. If you haven't already been able to suss that out, if you're watching us on video, you know that. And if you're not, you can always get this as a YouTube presentation. Also, it gets cut up a little bit for TikTok and other things. And also, be sure to tune in. All of these shows are available as podcasts. James Flippin's news cuts. Also, he's been filling in a lot over the holidays. And you just listened to my show, The Middle. Let's return to something, because I do think that it is about these attacks, terrorism or not, whatever you're going to call them, but also about a larger issue that's going to keep on going forward. And we touched on it briefly in the first segment, and that is how we've come to view this notion of the FBI and defund the FBI. The senator from Louisiana, this guy Kennedy, this table is smarter than Kennedy. But he did this thing during the press briefings. And by the way, if you want to pass a new law that says politicians can't come to these press briefings about what happened at crimes, it can't happen fast enough for me. They never add anything that are very interesting.
We agree on that, by the way. I can't stand the 40 people standing there. It's like, come on.
And another thing, if you can't answer questions about a crime, don't hold a press conference about a crime and then invite people there just to say, I can't tell you. I think reporters will be smart enough to understand, if you want to put out a thing that says what you've heard about it being from Eagle Pass is not true, put that statement out. But don't hold a press conference just to stand up there, have us all tune in to have you say we don't know anything. And then to make it worse in New Orleans is they said we're investigating other people. That turned out, and investigations sometimes go this way, that turned out not to be the case in the New Orleans case. But let me just talk to you a little bit. I'm fascinated by the meta of the FBI and law enforcement and where it sits in the pantheon of left and right. We do left versus right. And if you were to come down, land from Mars and listen to the show, I'm the one defending the law enforcement. You're the one skeptical of it. It's like the roles have been worse the last several years. What do you think? We now are going to have the Republicans in charge of the House and Senate and the presidency. They're choosing the new head of the FBI. Is it the idea that you said a couple of weeks ago, I don't think the rank and file of the FBI are not on the level. I think it's the brass. The brass rises up from the rank and file. Tell me your theory about what's going wrong with the FBI.
Well, I think that there's some similarities between, say, the way some people on the right look at the military and the way some people look at the FBI, because you alluded to it, the brass and who rises from the ranks of just kind of being an agent who's kind of out on the street or investigating cases for somebody who's more of an administrator. You do kind of sometimes wonder, what is it that gets you ahead in all those different federal bureaucracies? Is it just being good at your job, or is it being good at gaming the system? Is it being good at playing the game, or is it being a really good federal cop, a law enforcement agent? We've talked about that in terms of aspects of Congress and federal politicians in that respect, right? Are you answering your constituents, or are you answering the special interest groups that are potentially funding your next campaign and stuff like that? So I think that there's an important distinction to be made, because it is very fascinating. You talk about it. If you were an alien and you came down from outer space, you'd say, wait a second, I thought these ones on the right kind of are super into police and order, and these ones on the left say it's more about civil liberties and keeping people from overwrought police. But I don't know exactly how to explain that. It is kind of fascinating. People on the left say defund police, and they kind of talk more about like local police departments. People on the right who want to say defund the FBI or reduce the fund, that's the federal version of it. So sometimes I think it's just that all politics comes down to local politics, right? Like the most important thing for most people, and I guess I'm talking from my perspective, are the most representative officials you have, the closest ones to you, the ones you interact with the most. A lot of people, myself included on the right, tend to have a bigger problem with the federal largesse and the federal government's
But when did this start?
Than the local government.
This is new. When did you suddenly decide you don't trust the FBI?
I think that there's been elements of it kind of brewing.
When they let me offer you some
choices.
choices.
As far back as, okay.
Was it when they crash landed on the Hillary Clinton campaign?
Well, I think that there was a lot of indications that that whole issue was sort of soft-stepped in a way that was done because Hillary Clinton was sort of an established member of government, right? Former Secretary of State, former senator from New York. She kind of got protected by the federal government, including its agents on the...
So you were that rare Republican who's saying, I cannot believe how the FBI is holding a press conference to announce they've reopened an investigation into Hillary Clinton's server right in the final days of a 2000, that James Comey was working as an agent of the Democrats when he did that. It doesn't add up.
It certainly doesn't. And I think that's because what happened was in the lead up to that time when James Comey in the closing days of that 2016 campaign season said, well, we are still looking into it. In the months, weeks leading up to that, we'd heard a lot, and some of that is through that new age reporting on social media and stuff like that, about the bleach bit server and the fact that a hammer was taken to some server that Hillary Clinton had, and the investigations that were supposedly kind of stonewalled by efforts she had in not responding to various subpoenas. So people said, okay, what's going on here? Was that properly investigated? Was it not? The BlackBerry, again, some of this is kind of like nebulously in the back of my head.
But you're losing the train a little bit. The point I'm making is the FBI ultimately could have cost her the election.
I think that there was a lot of pressure on a guy like Comey to basically come out and say, we're really actually very neutral. And to push back on this narrative coming from the right that we didn't do enough, you should know we're reopening this investigation.
The FBI
wasn't anything.
The FBI doesn't talk. The FBI is the Justice Department. They investigate.
Right.
Comey in 2016 decided to hold press conferences announcing whether or not an indictment was going to be brought. You're the FBI, pal. Mm-hmm. So if you tell any Democrat, the FBI is way into the Democrats suddenly, in 2016, they would say, are you out of your mind? Never has there been a non-indictment that was announced at a press conference by the head of the investigating agency to announce why they, air quotes, didn't indict Hillary Clinton. And then weeks later, in the window leading up to, the FBI guy again violates every Justice Department rule and starts holding another announcements about why they're reopening Hillary Clinton's campaign.
So to turn it back on you for a second, what is your theory as to why Comey operated that way?
Because because he's an incompetent idiot, and also because there are a lot of people within the FBI in his agency, an overwhelmingly Republican agency, that was playing games all the way along. I know firsthand. They had a laptop of mine for weeks and weeks and weeks that they looked at, determined there was nothing on it, and suddenly leaks all of the FBI, including to Rudy Giuliani, and said, where's the Weiner laptop? We think something's going to happen with that. And then, boom, suddenly, after holding it for months, they suddenly say, we got to reopen the investigation, which, by the way, lasted them about 3 days because they already had everything on it. Here's the point. The FBI, law enforcement, as we've talked about this before, they're all a bunch of Republicans. I have a problem with that. It's just that's their bias. Mm-hmm. That's generally been the problem. It changed in answer to my own question when they started investigating your guy. And then suddenly, wait a minute, whoa, we don't want law enforcement to affect our guy.
That's your perception of the situation. But at the same time, what I'm telling you is that there was a lot of skepticism and a lot of question coming from the right even before Trump was elected, as to what is or isn't going on with Hillary's emails.
By the way,
that's where a lot of this came from.
I get it. Who is doing all that leaking? Where is the information all coming from?
I'm going to have to guess members of the FBI.
According to the Inspector General report that put out a whole report about this, it was all members of the FBI because they were inside the Justice Department.
Well, clearly somebody that was in there didn't think it was right what was going on.
No, they wanted to stop Hillary Clinton.
Right.
That's my
because
point.
They thought that she had violated the
whatever
law
their reason. Well, let me ask you
this.
Let me get back to your answer earlier, where you said they wanted to be policy, they wanted to get ahead. Look into the camera, speak into the microphone to the FBI agents who take an oath of office to do a job a certain way, and say you think most of them, or overwhelming, or lots of them, don't live up to that oath. Instead, they're doing politics. Is that what you think?
I don't really know how many different people are or aren't taking their thumb on or off the scale of justice. I think that
that's a cowardly way out. But that's a way of saying, that's what Donald Trump's saying. Some people say.
I think we also know that there are definitely different administrators within any office that have more power than other people. So if one key person says, I feel a certain type of way about keeping Trump out of the White House because he's a anti-democracy agent of chaos, going to change all the norms, come after, we don't want this guy. And I'm going to make efforts to keep his opponent in a good light here. I mean, that could certainly happen.
Here's the other thing about the FBI. And it's all law enforcement. Law enforcement investigates crimes. They don't prosecute crimes. They investigate crimes. Mm-hmm. So you're essentially saying that the FBI...
But they work together. It's a partnership.
Yeah, no, they provide. Actually,
right?
Yes
like
and no.
Beginning.
No, I mean they do. They're part of the administration of justice. Yes. So what you're suggesting is that there are a substantial number. You won't tell me how many or what percentage. A substantial number of members of the FBI who don't do that. Who don't provide information that they've investigated to prosecutors, and that they make it up. Lie about it because they're out to get down. And the other members of the FBI, they're blind to it. They don't say anything.
Well, but I mean, let's just kind of say this, right? There are clear examples of law enforcement agencies. Let's not necessarily make it the FBI, but just for this example, it's some other more local prosecutor or police department. Politics do play in, right? Like the way L.A., for example, prosecutes crime or enforces laws that are on the books. Even the laws that are on the books are different from
That's
Topeka,
a prosecutor,
Kansas,
but that's different. We're not talking about prosecutors now. I'm not talking about the investigators, the cops.
Well, but the cops, I'll put it to you this way. The cops that work in Chicago, L.A., or New York, by and large, are more likely more left of center than the cops that work in, say, red.
No.
Why not? Why?
Cops are the most conservative people in every community. What, are you new in town? Have you met cops?
Yes,
cops are conservative guys. They go into the business to bust crime.
Generally speaking, that's true. But in terms of like the whole Overton window debate and the whole like sliding standards and norms in New York City, for example, you don't talk to ICE, right? You don't work with the federal authorities when it comes to potentially deporting.
Right, but that doesn't mean that
criminals.
That doesn't mean the police officers are not arresting them.
Maybe do that in some town like Shreveport, Louisiana. I don't know.
I know. Hold on a second. Let's keep an eye on what the FBI is. The FBI investigates crimes. They invest terrorism. They investigate interstate laws. They investigate federal
Certainly
crimes.
As long as if it's like white supremacists and parents at school board meetings, but maybe not Islamic.
And how about this? And Russia trying to put the finger on the scale for Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. Right? That the FBI did that investigation.
When they bought like 500 Facebook ads or something like that.
No, the FBI. Well, you can believe the FBI is incompetent. Is that your position now?
No, I'm saying the so-called led to indictments. Election interference.
Led to indictments.
Some Facebook
led to
ads.
Indictments, Mr. Tough on Crime. It led to indictments. Okay, so the FBI, the NYPD, the detectives. They investigate crimes. You can say prosecutors should prosecute this or prosecute that. You can say lawmakers should make laws against this or law against that. The FBI guys go out and investigate crimes. You like that.
Yeah, the point I was sort of, I think in my opinion, struggling to make, ham-fistedly trying to make, is that politics does make its way into police departments, makes its way into prosecutorial offices. It's part of it. Some prosecutors have to face election.
Most of them do. But you're suggesting that the FBI has lost trust because it is an agency of investigation that has been too hard on the right and too soft on the left. Come on. It's just mind-boggling. If we filled up Studio 77 right now with FBI agents from top to bottom, and we gave them truth serum and asked if they voted for Donald Trump, I'd be surprised if there were 5 that did.
Okay, but let me give you a different example, because I think your example is well-founded. What about some sort of, blue-collar union and what the rank and file, the way they may or may not vote, versus the leadership of that union? There's a clear dichotomy often with that, where the leadership of some of these big-time trade unions are very, very left.
But let me take that
example.
Because
the money they take in as donations.
But that's like saying that the longshoremen do a good or bad job taking the goods out of the containers because they're one thing or another. This is a very different thing.
When they went on strike and paralyzed the nation's economy.
You're saying do not trust law enforcement because, and I think that you have not given me any reason to think this isn't true, because one guy got investigated by them and found out, by the way, it wasn't even him. They investigated the Russian interference in our elections. And the head of Republican head of the FBI put out a report saying that the guy was helped by the Russians and colluded with them, and we just can't prosecute him because he's the president. We don't prosecute presidents. And ever since then, that guy has been saying the FBI sucks. You have to defund the FBI, and then James Flippin. Like my cult leader says, don't like FBI. I was pro-cop until 15 minutes ago.
Anthony's doing
now
a very
I'm
good.
anti-cop. Now
Anthony's doing a great
guy.
Frankenstein, a very good Frankenstein right now.
Exactly.
I want to narrate. No, look, I think that you're trying to say that it's just the one thing, and in a vacuum, maybe you could say that we don't like the fact that Trump was
a criminal,
persecuted, let's say. But even if you don't just talk about that, Trump has always said, they're not coming after me, they're coming after you. I'm just standing in the way. And when you look at January 6th, when you look at parents at school board meetings being treated as if they're criminals because they're not sure about transgenderism and, indoctrination and stuff like that, when you talk about that white supremacy is the biggest threat domestically in terms of terrorism, that's when people say, okay, I'm not so sure you guys are doing the right thing.
That's totally fair. If you are paying off a porn star to try to influence the outcome of an election, or if you are cooperating with the Russians as they try to interfere with our election, they hell yeah are coming for you. And we'll be right back.
It's the left versus the right. From Studio 77, it's a 77 WABC debate. 77 WABC.
So welcome back to Left versus Right, the first Left versus Right of the year 2025. Here we are, another year together. And let's talk about, I don't even know what to call it. Chaos on our subways here in New York. And you don't have to be just a New Yorker. I get calls from people around the country because now these things are on video. You have a woman set on fire. We've talked briefly about that. Insane video of a guy getting pushed under a subway car. I take the subway every day. I'm sure you do. And I can tell you that, just on the ride here, people pressed up against the wall of the subway. Let me ask you this question. Is there anything you can do? We've got 8 million people who live in our city, 11 million it swells to during a busy weekday. You've got mental health issues, but it's not even clear that this guy that pushed the guy he was just a bad person. What can we learn here? There are some policy things we can learn, but, it's almost like, man, it's just not what's terrifying about it, and I'm having trouble putting it to words, is how completely random it is. Right. It wasn't like people had a beef about something, and from reporting on crime, 90% of the time, two people killing each other, it's people had a beef or something was going on. Yeah. The randomness of this really has us shaken as a city and, frankly, the country as well. Yeah,
I think that's definitely true, and I'm curious to get your perspective on it at some point too, kind of as a lifelong New Yorker or somebody who's been taking the subways for so long. It's like you hear different things from different people, right? And it's hard sometimes for me to parse it out, what is politics and what isn't politics. Because, look, we're all New Yorkers. We talk about the city. We experience the city. It's a thing. And there's a lot of people who say, oh, the subways are as bad as they were back in the 70s and 80s. There's some people who say it's not, or maybe it's different from what it was back then. I've heard people talk about like actual robberies maybe in the 80s versus just kind of like you said, the randomness of it all. I don't know. A lot of times I do think that it comes down to actually having a purpose and a focus behind fixing it and the money that it's going to take to also do that, because there's a sense I have that kind of the subways are one of those political footballs almost. Like, it's bad, it's underfunded, congestion pricing, homelessness, mental health, outreach. I saw some outreach workers today. It's like they kind of dance around the issue of that the subway is just kind of a nasty, decrepit place. You know what I mean? Like the trains by themselves, sometimes they get upgraded, but the tracks and the platforms, they're dingy, they're dirty. There's all kinds of people peeing and doing drugs in there. It's chaos. It is disorder, and you don't necessarily see cops around a lot. It's kind of just like the Hades, the underworld of New York City, and potentially, especially in some spots of Manhattan. So I think that the thing that needs to be answered is the mental health thing and like the chronic homelessness and the chronic drug use and dehydration and schizophrenia and all that kind of stuff that turns to violence and mayhem and disorder. Without there being kind of a stepped up standard, I guess, and a will for the cops to actually take people and say, look, you need to go into this center, you need to go into this drug rehab, you need to do that. It's not your choice anymore. Until that happens, I don't think it's going to change. And I get that that's a sticky thing because it's like violating people's civil liberties. But at the same time, the greater society has to be the bigger concern, I think.
I mean, look, and you're grasping for it. I'm grasping for it. one thing it's not easy to do is to look at the numbers and learn anything. You know, we've had
some of us don't necessarily believe the numbers.
Well,
either.
that's your hang up, man. For a news guy, you don't seem to believe anybody. But I mean, look, if you can have murders go up 100%, go up from 5 to 10, and 10. In the scheme of not hundreds of thousands, but millions of rides every year, you can say, wow, what are the chances I get hit by lightning or eaten by a shark in the subways? But there is this thing that public officials have to deal with, this notion of perception. And I think that regardless, you can have fights about the crime statistics all you want. And we just saw what happened. We had a campaign in 2024 where Donald Trump succeeded in saying the crime has never been higher when all the FBI crime statistics and all this, generally speaking, crime is lower. But if there is a perception of disorder, and you touched upon it, this notion that, you know what, people aren't paying their fare, people are lying on 3 subway cars. We've always had a certain amount of mental illness in the subways, but since COVID, it's now gotten to be a situation where it's just about every car and every ride you take, there is someone dealing with some kind of a mental crisis. So there are like policy things to do. Like I think you have to change the laws. Kathy Hochul finally announced that she's willing to do this so that people who are dealing with mental things right now, in order, you can take them off the subway, but you've got to bring them somewhere. And when you take them somewhere, you've got to, if you want to hold them, you can't arrest them. Being homeless and strung out, you usually can't arrest them for that.
It's not a crime.
But you can hold them involuntarily. But the present law in New York State, and it's different from state to state, is the only standard a judge looks at is this person going to do harm to themselves or someone else? And sometimes you can't show that. It's the person just standing there. But the thing you can show is they're not participating in their own care. And that should be a standard that allows us to hold them. And then the question becomes, well, we got to be prepared. We always say whatever it takes to build jail cells for criminals, we got to do. It should also be that psychology around, no pun intended, psychology and whether people are mentally able. Right now, the biggest reason that homeless people are out on the streets is there ain't no place to put them. So when the cops come, even if they come with a special worker, even if they take them away, even if they get a judge to agree, you still have to say, where are you going to put them? Mm-hmm. And right now, for example, out in Queens, people who are New York residents will know this place, Creedmoor. It's a big mental health, a psychiatric hospital. I don't know how else to put it. Maybe there's a more gentle word for it.
A sanitarium.
Right. And they are now taking a lot of the land there and developing it as housing. We need housing, don't get me wrong. But maybe break off a little bit of that and build some facilities, maybe even SRO-type facilities for people that are dealing with mental breaks that don't go to prison, but should not be on our streets and on our subways.
Yeah.
So there are policy things. But this is a difficult thing because this is where we rely upon our public figures to say, you know what? Not that you're wrong, that the subway is a nice place. Say, I get it. I see what you're saying here.
So are you sort of in a way taking issue with the approach of like a Mayor Adams who kind of continues to say, it's just the idea. There's only 6 incidents per day.
You know, I got to tell you, I think that facts matter, and we rely upon people like you in the news to contextualize things. And sometimes it's easy to say, there's a horrible story. One person sees that story and then comes to the conclusions about how dire it is in the subways. And I take the subway every day. I don't think it's as bad as people say, but I also think it ain't great. I grew up in the 1970s. I used to believe as a kid growing up that the subways came off the assembly line with graffiti already on them. I had never seen a subway that didn't have graffiti.
Right.
And then scratch graffiti and everything else. I was on one of these fancy new C trains the other day. It was like, oh my God, I'm in Paris. But if you go to Paris, you don't have the same conditions on the platforms that we do for some reason. And is it because there's some crazy socialist country? I don't know. I just think that there's not a willingness to accept that type of behavior.
I think that's a good way. It's well said, that last phrase that you had, not accepting that type of behavior. I think that in some ways, the country that we have, the city that we have, what's so great about it and what's so amazing and special and unique about it also kind of gets us into trouble, right? We want to sort of look the other way and be understanding and compassionate. That's a word that's used a lot, compassion. But what is real compassion, right? Like, how much compassion are we actually showing to people who live their entire life in the subway, riddled by schizophrenia, riddled by drugs, the lights are on all the time, it's noisy all the time, they don't sleep, they have any number of issues mentally and physically. And that's not really compassion. And furthermore, it's not a functional society to do it that way. Like the turnstile jumping thing is crazy. I don't know what else to say about that. Like, we need to actually enforce the ability. But again, too often, and I'm going to put this back on you, people on the left sort of say, oh, well, it's just poverty and you're criminalizing poverty. And everybody's got to participate in society on some level, or else it ceases to function.
You know what? I tell you, here's what I think, and I think this is important for the left and important for Democrats. We have to understand that public spaces are for the public. And whatever we may think about the rights of a homeless person to live in dignity, to get care, to be fed, to be clothed, to find housing.
Mm-hmm. And I think the majority of people say that's
right.
You
can hold that view and also hold the view but Gerard, who is outside Dunkin' Donuts on 14th and B that I walk by every day because there's a manhole grate there that heats up that he sleeps on. You know what? I want him to be well, but I also think our neighborhood has the right to have that public space back. And I think you can hold both of those thoughts at the same time. And maybe the politicians in New York, and maybe I'll be one in the future again, politicians in New York have to learn to speak like that. Like, there's a broad consensus in our city that we want to take care of people like that. We know who they are. We give them money. We give them a donut when we come out of Dunkin' Donuts. But we also have every right that when we're walking our kids to school to not have to walk over him. Mm-hmm. And what it does say is that we have failed. I don't care what your policy is. It's failed if that guy is there. It's failed. And you can't just say, okay, it's his right to be there. That's what it means to live in New York City. I don't think that's acceptable. Let me just one other point on this. When it comes to the subways, one of the things that whether you're left, right, or center, when you're paying your fare and then you see 5 people come in behind you not paying their fare, I don't care what your politics are, your sense of fairness is offended by that. You know what I'm saying?
If I could borrow a term, Anthony, I think it makes you feel like a schmuck.
I mean, your sense of fairness, and Democrats and Republicans both, at least in their rhetoric about politics, is fairness, right? I want just fairness. Just give me fairness. And so I don't believe that policymakers are right when they say, well, some people don't want that. I am totally fine. If someone wants to say as a position, I believe there should be free subways and buses. I may not agree with them, but that's my position. Get rid of all the turnstiles, get rid of the employees, make it a thing we can all use, get rid of the congestion by doing that. Okay, that's a position. But to say the status quo, where we now are hiring people for the minimum wage to just watch passively while people hop over, and for people not from New York City, that's what we're doing. We have these guys who have the jackets, say security on them. They don't do anything to report, anything to stop it. Maybe they're taking count. Maybe I don't know. Who knows?
I have seen some guys who at least kind of stand and block the emergency exit, walking in the emergency exit.
I mean, every guy I've seen, they stand next to the door because they don't want to get into a beef with it. And I don't blame them, right? They're probably trained not to get into beefs with someone.
Right.
But that's how bad it's become, that we just put a security jacket on someone. And so I do think that but you're right about the challenge here in New York City that Mayor Adams has. He's been all over the map. If you campaign as being a tough on crime guy, that's got to be your thing. You can't suddenly say, oh, crime's not so bad, or it's gotten better because this category is lower.
Yeah.
You can have academic conversations about that, but for people when they're feeling viscerally, that video of that young man getting pushed onto tracks, and thank God he's alive, hopefully he fully recovers, that undermines whatever. And I don't know if you remember this, you were too young. There was this guy from Utah, came in to see the U.S. Open, was pushed onto the track, killed. He was killed on a subway platform in, I want to say, 1988, 89. And there was this headline in the New York Post. Dave Dinkin was the mayor. It says, Dave, do something. Okay?
I'm at least aware of that headline.
It changed the whole conversation because that's what we were feeling. Just do something here. Solve this problem. And I think that's kind of where we are. On a slightly lighter note to wrap up with, 2025 is here, and to ring it in, someone breaks in to Gracie Mansion, live, I think filming or live streaming himself, finds a couple of tchotchkes around the place.
Like a Christmas ornament or something?
Right. Walks around for a while. Finally, someone, and it's one of the most heavily secured places in all of New York City, one of the mayor's security detail outside, not inside, sees him on videotape, goes in, arrests him. But here's the thing I want to ask you about. It's 4:20 on the morning, New Year's. Adams wasn't there. Okay. I'm fine. Nightlife mayor, sure. It's January 1st. He rang in the New Year. 4:20 in the morning, my dude. Get to bed.
Yeah.
You've got a city to run in the morning.
Well, I mean, look, your boy Curtis is going to be saying it's the swagger man with no plan. He just wants to party.
The nightlife mayor.
The nightlife mayor, yeah. Well, I mean, I thought you were going to go in a different direction. I thought you were going to say maybe he was at his pad in Fort Lee or whatever.
Well, explain that. Yeah, I mean, explain that a little bit.
Well, so there was reporting during the campaign for mayor that Adams, I guess, has an alternate residence or has
he owns an apartment in Jersey.
Yeah.
He owns.
And then he lives there, I guess, most of the time.
Well, that's the thing about not being at Gracie Mansion. Now, he has said in the past one of the reasons he doesn't stay at Gracie Mansion is because it's haunted.
I did hear him say that.
So there might be that.
Has that been like a long-standing lore?
By the way, I remember when I ran for mayor. I would get these questions. Are you going to live in Gracie Mansion? Because Mike Bloomberg, who came before, lived in this beautiful house. He didn't move in it. I'm like, half the reason I'm running for mayor is the public housing, for God's sakes. Why would I? It's some change for a guy from
giving up that upside.
A guy from Brooklyn to live in a place called a mansion. Of course, I'm going to live there.
Right.
But it was a little bit puzzling. One, how the guy got in that far. For those who are unfamiliar with the geography, it sits at the very end of Carl Schurz Park. It's basically in a park, but it's got an ironclad security all around it, but someone was able to get in. It just goes to show.
I don't know how that happens.
I mean, it is.
I mean, it's not like you could get into City Hall that easily, even at that time of night.
You shouldn't be able to get in there either, and eventually they got him. I thought the funniest part of the story is not the guy broke in on some social media dare or something, was that the mayor of our city, with all that he's got, he's got a lot of reasons to be staying up all night in terms of the pressure that he's under.
Yeah.
But I thought that was.
Does it cut any ice with you that it was New Year's, or that maybe he was?
Okay, listen. I mean, I'm 60. Me seeing the ball drop is a big accomplishment for me at this point.
It's like, all right, good, I can go to sleep.
The idea of being at Times Square for the ball drop, if I were mayor, I'd have to do that. I'd drop the ball and say, everyone go home now, please.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I buy it, but I got to give the guy credit. If he's out at 4:30 in the morning, wherever he was.
I guess on some level it's more power to him. Like, party till you can't party anymore, and good for you. Stay young that way. But, yeah, you would like to think that the mayor of New York City has their focus on more important things.
Well, Happy New Year to you. You know where the party never ends? With Vinny Medugno coming up.